So, have you ever wanted to run a game with a deeper story where your players really think through the consequences of their actions? Have you ever wanted your players to deepen their level of empathy with the characters that they're role-playing? And have you ever wanted your players to learn a little something about themselves because of how they've chosen to play their characters? If your answer is yes to any of these questions, then strap in because we're going to go on a journey about deep role-playing in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Hi everybody, my name is John from DM Shower Thoughts, where we find our best selves through gaming. And today, we're really going to follow through on that tagline by really deeply understanding the characters that we're role-playing. Now to start off, this video is less tutorial and more just personal testimony from my experience as a DM. Now if you want to further self-educate on this topic, then one of the YouTube channels I highly recommend is Zipper on Disney, and you can find that link in the cards above. In addition, as I was researching for this video, I really took a lot of inspiration from the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, as well as Eberron Rising from the Last War. And if you have other links to similar videos that explore ideas like this, please leave them in the comments and I'll make sure to check them out as well. And now, on to the content. A major part of tabletop role-playing's appeal is that it isn't bound by the limitations of programmings from video games and similar media. It's a storytelling vehicle that allows dungeon masters to deliver customized experiences table to table. And of course, the only real limit is your imagination. And yet, with all of that freedom, a lot of dungeon masters feel that their epic stories fall flat because they or their players weren't as committed to its delivery as they could have been. If anything, this highlights the value of having a session zero. So, a session zero is a special kind of session that happens before the campaign officially starts. Everyone agrees going in that there's not going to be any gameplay. A session zero could be where players are creating their characters, a dungeon master is pitching their world concept, and it's really getting everyone on the same page about what to expect in the sessions that are going to follow. So as a dungeon master, part of a session zero is that it gives you the space to address all of the usual things that tend to kill role-playing sessions. Things like scheduling, understanding the world building, the format and the tone of the game. What I mean by that is, let's go back to that earlier example, where a dungeon master is trying to deliver an epic story, like the Odyssey or the Iliad, and the players really take it in more of a comedic direction, which undermines the dungeon master's tone. Or let's say the opposite, where the dungeon master really wants to just kind of lay back and play beer and pretzels D&D, but the players really go into some really dark or traumatic territory that the dungeon master is uncomfortable with. A session zero allows you to lay the foundation of your expectations as the DM going in, as well as train your players to have healthy habits that are going to help perpetuate that style of game. And this by no means that you have to stick with the tone that you started with and you have no ability to change mid-campaign, but really it's just making sure everyone is on the same page and you're preemptively answering questions so that you don't get stuck playing a game that you don't really enjoy because it's not really what you planned for. Now, in my most recent Session Zero, I actually stole a little trick from our fellow DM podcaster, Adamus. What I did is, as part of my pitch of the world, and as part of laying out my expectations, as part of character creation, I had 10 questions that I wanted my players to answer for themselves so that they can deepen their role-playing with their character. Now, while I simply just asked the questions sequentially and asked the players to think about it, I also made sure to follow up with each of the players individually with one-on-one conversations so that they wouldn't feel pressure to answer their questions in a certain way, and they had pretty much unlimited time to really work through who their character was. Now, not only does this allow them to deeper roleplay with their characters, it actually equips them with certain tools to ask deeper questions of themselves and also be able to recognize really good answers. And that's really how we're discovering our best selves through role-playing. Our character gives us a safe space to explore parts of ourselves we might otherwise be unwilling to. And through that, it informs our outlook of our own world. So if you didn't handle a situation as well as you wanted to role-playing wise, well, now that's a rep. And now you have more information and more experience for when you deal with actual people. So anyway, here are the 10 questions that I asked my players during our latest session 0. And once again, I would love to highlight, this is not my original content. This is just a testimony to what happened when I delivered this content. Question number 1 is pretty generic. Where was your character born and who is their family? I like this one to start off with because it helps cement their character in the world that the DM is building. It also gives the DM an opportunity to give that player additional information that they would have growing up in a specific region or locale in the world that other characters may not have access to. And if they reveal that information, they might find they have some commonalities with other players in the group. For example, in the session I just ran, 2 players individually had decided that their characters came from the same region of the world. So when one character made mention of their backstory, it actually piqued the interest of the other character, and they were able to find common ground because of their experiences. Now, a lot of players, especially new players, will go for a tragic orphan backstory. Part of this question is also setting up a surrogate family, such as a mentor or a close friend. So that way, as the DM, you still have NPCs that you can leverage for storytelling possibilities at a later time. Now, this is also where I'm going to give a quick tip. As the DM, a huge part of your job is building trust in a relationship between you and your players. So even though part of the DM's toolbox is putting backstory NPCs in danger to motivate the party, I wouldn't rely on it because then it lessens the impact each time you do it. For example, one of the NPCs detailed in the latest campaign I'm running is a character's father who can act as an informant and as a teacher throughout the campaign. However, I'm not going to have a whole thing where the father gets kidnapped to motivate the player. I may do that for another character, but I want this player to feel kind of safe that she has somebody that she can go to when she needs help. And that way too, you're creating dynamic stories where each NPC is as individual as the players. So, on to question number 2, which is asking what social class you were born into. Now for me, this can help a player determine the worldview of their character. I also had a thing where your starting gold amount should be informed by that social class, even if there's not a direct association. So for example, just because your character comes from nobility doesn't mean you start with more gold, and just because you start poor doesn't mean you start with less. For example, if your character comes from an impoverished background, they may instead be really hesitant to spend their gold, so they actually get more starting currency. And if you have a player that was kind of like a trust fund kid, and they had a lot of gold, they may have gambled it all away by the time the story starts. So even though there's some kind of connection to kind of think that through, I actually let my players decide how much starting wealth they start with. So even though there's not a direct association, I still let my players decide for themselves how much wealth that they start with and how that was informed by their background. It can also lead to other social interactions. For example, if a character was a noble, do they flaunt their family name or are they embarrassed by it? And like with any of these 10 questions, the real power is that they're leveraged into more specific questions when you have one-on-one chats with each player. So the third question I ask my players, how did you come into your character class? And who taught you the skills that you have? This is one that you hear a lot of YouTube content creators ask when they're putting together their Session 0 videos. And you hear it a lot because it's a really good question. Your character's abilities should be cemented in the world, even if you're taking some creative liberties with the prescribed lore that's given in each class's section in the player's handbook. The source of your druid's primal magic can be a story in and of itself, or a rogue learning how to pickpocket from a master could create an NPC that involves deeper storytelling. And like I said before, just because a player gives you an NPC doesn't mean it should be used to leverage against them. If a player is willing to create an NPC that acts as a mentor or informant, that is now a tool the DM has to enrich that player's engagement with the world. And that's one of my personal theories about D&D world building. The Dungeon Master does a lot of the foundational work, but a lot of the flavor and a lot of the personal, intimate stories are delivered by the players. This also leads to question number 4. I ask my players, who helped or hindered you along your path? Now, we've already asked some questions that could get a player thinking about who may have helped them, say learn their abilities from their character class, but also this gives players the opportunity to create a rival. Not necessarily a direct antagonist or enemy, but just somebody else that stays relevant in their character's story. Although that being said, this could create the space for a player to create a dynamic villain that the DM can then use as part of their character's story. Question 5 I have for my players is, what is their character's view on politics and religion? This is a good world building question, and out of all the questions I'm going to ask, this is the one I let my players off the hook with the most. While some players are interested in political intrigue or having a religious character or a character that's against organized religion, there are a lot of players that are uninterested in exploring those topics in a game environment. And that is totally okay for me. However, one thing that I do remind my players for their characters is just because their characters aren't interested in politics doesn't mean that the world's politics aren't interested in them. Now, question 6 helps my players be a little more proactive. I just ask them, what's your character's current goal? A lot of my players start with goals that are a little abstract or a little less guided, and this allows the tone of the campaign and the events that they play through to focus what their character's motivations are. Now, if you watched my video on player styles, you'll know that one spectrum I noticed of player agency is proactive versus reactive players. This question can be kind of hard for a reactive player that's more using their character as an avatar for their own exploration of the world. However, the one thing I do make clear to players like this is if your character isn't going to have a specific goal that you get me on board with, then to please not interrupt other players from pursuing their personal goals. Basically, if you as a player are more reactive to the campaign's events, try not to say things like, that's not what my character would go with if the DM presents a mission. XP to level 3 had an awesome video about building an adventurer, someone that's willing to adventure when you build a character for these games. It's a very similar sentiment. Basically, this is the part where as a DM, I lay out that my expectation for my players is that their characters would be involved in the mission that I present them unless they had individual goals they wanted to pursue. If players present me with a goal they'd like to follow through on, then I, as the Dungeon Master, allow them to take the driver's seat for a little bit. But if they don't have specific goals, then basically the dynamic is that I'll present them with a mission that they can do. And that doesn't always mean they have to follow through with their objective, but it does mean that they're going to do me the due diligence of at least seeing where the story takes them. Otherwise, why are we all playing? And just because a player doesn't start the game with a defined goal doesn't mean one won't shape for them as they play. At least by asking the question, we're starting to frame the experience, and again, let the players ask themselves at the end of each session, does my player have a goal? Am I progressing towards that goal? Or has my goal changed now that I have new information that I've discovered from the campaign? Now, to take a little bit of a pause for a second, one of the things I did during my session 0, like I said, was just ask the 10 questions sequentially. I let my players kind of percolate their answers to those questions, and then we had a one-on-one conversation about what their answers might be, with, of course, help from the DM's world-building point of view to help cement their characters in the story. Now, the first 6 questions that I just kind of laid out had pretty simple answers, but as I went through the list, I noticed that most of my players hadn't really thought through the next 2 questions, 7 and 8. And during the one-on-one conversation, when I asked my players about these blind spots in their characters' backstories, it gave them all pause. They're difficult questions to answer because a lot of times they're the kind of questions that force us to examine parts of ourselves we're uncomfortable with. Question number 7 I got from Eberron Rising from the Last War, which is, what does your character regret? And question number 8, I did steal from Zipper on Disney. What lie does your character tell themselves to make things easier? Yeah, I know. I love these 2 questions because what it does is bring the other 6 into context. I can't tell you how much deeper my players' answers were for those 6 questions after I posed these 2. Maybe the lie you tell yourself is you don't need others to be effective. That may influence the relationship you have between your party members and the NPCs that you created for your DM. Maybe your regret is you weren't able to help a friend when they needed it. And that might start to shape your character's motivations and their goal moving forward. And again, it's not just posing these questions and moving on, it's asking specific follow-up questions based on how your players are answering them. And this kind of culminates in question number 9. How does your character see their story ending? This one is especially poignant given a lot of the media that's been distributed over the past few years. Thanos got what he wanted at the end of Infinity War. He saw his story ending by having done what he felt needed to be done and then resting in a farmland afterward. Even if your player's character didn't start with a goal, they'll certainly be thinking of it after you ask this question. Does your character see themselves riding off in the sunset, retiring in a lavish mansion, or maybe dying valiantly against a horde of undead? Again, the more specific the player's answer, the more impactful the storytelling becomes. So, last but not least, question number 10 isn't as hard-hitting. Question number 10 is just how your character became acquainted with the party, or how they heard about the story hook that brings them into the adventure. Now, I do this out of session 0 or as part of a one-on-one conversation, just so that the player has input about how their character heard about the adventure. Could be that they read a sign on a notice board or they heard something from a friend. But this way, they feel like they have agency at the outset, rather than as the DM me determining how they heard about it. Some examples, like I said, are finding a notice board, perhaps being part of some adventurers guild. And as part of this, does anybody in the party already know each other before the campaign starts? This can be a cool way to set up some relationships and leverage into further role-playing. Now, these are the 10 questions that I posed to my players in our latest session 0. So now I ask you question number 11. What kind of questions do you ask yourself or your players during character creation? Do you prefer a heavier dramatic tone, or do you like to keep things kind of light and comedic? Let me know in the comments below, and remember, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.